as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Colin McSween is a JFK researcher and author who has captured Aubrey Rike's story in his new book called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Rike and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Tonight on Night Fright, we find out the inside story of what took place that fateful day, 22nd November 1963. Good evening, one and all. It's Brent, Holland from Night Fright. On the phone, long distance from Vancouver, we have none other than Colin McSween. Hi, Colin. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, Brent. Thanks.
Aubrey Rike. Was he called before the president had expired, or was he called afterwards?
Well, Aubrey Rike's story is pretty intriguing, but basically his arrival at Parkland Hospital with his assistant, Dennis McGuire, affectionately known as Peanuts. They had arrived at Parkland Code 3 with what was apparently an epileptic seizure patient who had collapsed on the street in the 100 block of North Houston, which was directly in front of the Texas Schoolbook Depository building. They'd been dispatched on that call at 12:19. They picked the patient up at about 12:21 or 12:22, and they had taken him to Parkland. Now, Aubrey and Dennis had a police radio in their ambulance, and they didn't hear any information about the shooting, which indicates to me that they were probably out of their ambulance in the emergency bay, removing their patient from the ambulance when the shooting occurred, which is why they didn't hear about it. They wheeled the patient into the front of the emergency department to the admissions desk, and the nurse was occupied, I believe, on the telephone at the time, but they had their patient on their cot, who they later discovered were Secret Service agents, burst in suits, and they were brandishing various types of weapons, and he said some of them were painted green, or at least colored green. It was the first time he'd seen green guns, and they were demanding gurneys, and they asked him for his gurney, and he, in so many words, told them to all be polite here to buzz off, that they couldn't have his cot until his patient had paid for the trip, or until they had obtained enough information from him so that they could bill him for the run. As they were standing there, they watched Vice President Lyndon Johnson come in, Vice President leaning against the wall, kind of sliding as he walked, and he was hanging onto his arm, and Aubrey said to Peanuts, he says, well, look at that. He said, the old S.of.A.'s had another heart attack, and this is what this is all about. Well, then a few moments later, they brought a cart in with the governor lying on his back and bleeding very heavily, and Aubrey says the blood was pouring from the cart and from his arm, and as they ran down the corridor toward Major Medicine, well, then a couple seconds, 10, 15 seconds later, in came another cart, and he couldn't see who it was on the cart, except the man appeared to be on his back in a fetal position, and he was covered. His head and torso appeared to be covered with a suit jacket. The only way he could guess who was on the cart was because he saw Jackie Kennedy running with her hand on the cart, still dressed in her pink suit, but with not wearing the hat at this point. And they had just seen the President and First Lady pass them. Aubrey and Peanuts had managed to park behind the crowd at an intersection at Cedar Springs and Harwood at about 17 minutes after 12, and had exchanged waves with President Kennedy at that point. So here they were watching the governor and the president being admitted for treatment. As soon as the president was wheeled past, pretty much the nurse told them to take their epileptic seizure patient to stall number 8, which was also in major medicine just outside of the radiology room. And as they transferred their patient to the cot, the Secret Service agents basically said, "You're with us from here on in until we tell you otherwise." And they said, "You're going to redress your cot or, put new linens on it." And Aubrey said, "Well, what are we doing?" He says, "Well, we're going to use you to transfer the president. We're going to move him to a Catholic hospital or to St. Paul Hospital, which was a couple of blocks down the road." So they got out to the ambulance, and Aubrey and Peanuts had backed their ambulance into the emergency bay, and immediately beside them, not 3 or 4 feet away, was the presidential limousine, and it had pulled in head first. The rear left-hand door was open, and they had a complete view of the back seat and, of course, the mess that had resulted from the shooting. He was quite astonished, actually, as they placed their stretcher in their ambulance. They stood there watching as the agents cleaned much of this mess from the rear of the car, and then they watched them replace the roof sections back on the car so that the car was basically back in its closed car configuration. And then after a few more minutes, the Secret Service agents and this helmeted police officer said, "You come with us." And they took them down to major medicine. They took them to the corridor between trauma 1 and 2. There was a cot against the wall by trauma 2. They said, "Sit here." So the 2 ambulance attendants jumped up and sat down, and as they got seated, they looked across, and right directly in front of them, not 4 feet away, was Jackie Kennedy. And she was sitting on a brown metal folding chair that Dr. Philip Earl Williams had managed to obtain and bring to the corridor so that the First Lady would have somewhere to sit. Now, she had apparently been in the trauma room a couple of times initially, including at one point where she offered some of the debris from her husband's skull that she'd scooped off the rear trunk deck when the car was still in DEALEY PLAZA. She'd offered it to the anesthesiologist, Dr. Marion Jenkins. Aubrey said that the entire time that he and Dennis were seated across from her in the corridor, that she never moved. She never went into the trauma room the whole time they were there. So my guess is that Aubrey and Dennis were probably in that location as of about, I would say 1:45 or maybe 10:1, something like that. And they were there for much of the next 15 or 20 minutes with her. I know that Aubrey assisted her getting her a cigarette. I also know that he assisted her by getting a moistened towel from the scrub room, which she used to clean herself off with to a greater extent. I also know that he got up and offered to get rid of the towel for her, and which she was very gracious and thanked him for. And he took the towel and put it back in the scrub room, and then he resumed his place with her, seated across from her. One of the more numbing aspects for him was when he glanced to his right at one point and noticed there was a U.S. military general standing pretty much at attention right near the trauma room, and he had the black square briefcase in his hand, and he was handcuffed to the briefcase.
The football.
And the football, the nuclear war code equipment in case of requiring a nuclear strike or nuclear retaliation. The reassuring part at that point, although they had no idea how badly injured he was or anything else, the reassuring thing was as long as that man was standing there, there was an awareness that whoever was in that trauma room was alive and was still a chief executive, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And of course, when that general was no longer there, that was kind of a bad sign.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turns out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Folks, we're speaking with Colin McSween from Vancouver. Colin McSween is a JFK author, JFK researcher. He's written a book about Aubrey Rike, whose story he's relating to us now. It's called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Rike and the Assassination of President Kennedy. It is available at www.jfklancer.com. Where else could people get your book?
Well, I know it's available at Amazon.com. The thing that's nice is for a lot of people that haven't read much on the assassination, this is an easy read. It's a comparatively small book, and for somebody who just wants to kind of get a bit of a taste or a bit of a flair for some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. Now, we've got a number of eyewitnesses over the years that have written books, people that were in DEALEY PLAZA or near DEALEY PLAZA that have recounted what they saw and heard. And, of course, we had Dr. Charles Crenshaw's book, which came out about 1991, Conspiracy of Silence. But the uniqueness of this is that Aubrey was both an undertaker, sort of a part-time undertaker, full-time ambulance attendant. Having been in those fields myself for about 30 years, I know that frequently the people in the undertaking establishment get quite a unique perspective and quite a unique look at things that maybe the medical people aren't looking at. Aubrey's story in some ways is considered medical evidence because there's some critical evidence that he did observe, that he either felt or saw pertaining to the president's wounds, and we can get to that shortly. But the tender aspect of handling the dead, especially in the presence of a widow or a family member.
Yes.
You know, Aubrey's such a wonderful guy that I've had him to Canada. I've had him up here to speak about 3 or 4 times, and he can't tell the story, especially what went on inside of Trauma Room 1 when he was there with the First Lady. He can't tell that without losing it. What we say in the acting profession, I'm also an actor, what we say, he's in the moment. You know, he's right back at 1 o'clock or 1:15 or 1:30 or whatever length of time he was in that room. He's just there. He's living it without too much of a twist of the imagination. You can see this white sheet enshrouded body on the table in front of him. You can see the tears in his eyes. You can just about see the First Lady standing there in her pink suit. It's unreal. It's a lot of people say, well, you tell the story as well as some of these people do. And I mean, assassination eyewitness Bill Newman tells people Colin's the sort of guy who can tell you what we're going to say before we say it, and he'll recite our story verbatim. But Colin prefers if we tell the story ourselves. And of course I do. I mean, you can't do better than to have someone tell the story, someone who was there that saw it and knows it.
Colin, let's go back a little bit. You had mentioned before, when you started to tell Aubrey's story, about an epileptic fit that took place around 12:20, a few minutes before the president's entourage was about to go by the Texas School Book Depository. I was wondering if you could tell that story a little bit, and also the story of a rash of phone calls that came in to the ambulance service the 2 weeks prior.
This particular aspect of the story raises as many questions as it does sort of resolve. That Aubrey is content with the findings of the FBI, which were documented both in May and in June of 1964, that this individual that they picked up with their ambulance had in fact sustained a head injury in an accident sometime prior and was actually undergoing some difficulty that required medication, could be easily perhaps be taken or mistaken as something like epilepsy. Aubrey and Dennis started work at about 8 that morning, made sure the car was clean and equipped and everything was ready to go. They worked for the O'Neill Funeral Home, an ambulance company, which was located at Oak Lawn, about a block and a half west of Lemon Avenue, which was a critical arterial route in the motorcade of President Kennedy. And they had a couple of emergency calls that morning. One was for a gentleman that they found on a street corner. They were sent to look after, and he was fully dressed and appeared to be in his right mind and was kind of resistant, didn't want any assistance, so they basically left him to himself because you couldn't take someone against their will. Then they got dispatched around 10:30 on a heart attack call, and it turned out to be a lady in a residence, and they had taken her to Baylor Hospital, which is sort of the southeast area of what was downtown Dallas at that time, sort of out toward the R.L. Thornton Freeway, and they had delivered that person, and they cleared, that is to say, they got back in their ambulance and let their dispatcher know they were available, and the dispatcher had logged their clear time as 12:05 noon. Now, at 12:05 noon, President Kennedy's motorcade was coming down Lemon, south on Lemon. It was about 6 blocks from the funeral home where Aubrey and Dennis worked, and it was actually approaching the Continental Underpass by a road called Lomo Alto, and this is all in the police radio, and we've put this in the book. You can actually follow along what was going on between Ambulance 606 and the police communications of the motorcade at the time. It's kind of compelling reading.
I bet. I'm intrigued already, yeah.
Aubrey and Dennis wanted to see the motorcade, and they figured if they got back to the funeral home, they'd have a chance to see the president there around Cedar Springs or Lemon. Aubrey just said to Dennis, he says, if they're at Craddock Park, there's no way we're going to get back there in time. Now, an interesting thing happens is the motorcade lead car passes Oak Lawn, the street where the funeral home is. They actually, a voice comes on the radio and says, the ambulances have arrived and are standing by. The ambulances have arrived and are standing by. So you got to wonder what this meant.
Yeah.
Standing by for what? Now, in the book, we share a little bit of this information that Aubrey says that in the days leading up to the president's visit, that there were a number of what they call bogus calls. They were getting sent all over the place on calls, most of them in the downtown area within 5 or 6 blocks or so of where the assassination would later occur on November 22nd. Aubrey said it was almost like somebody was timing us.
That's what I would think. That would be my first impression also.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he has nothing to go on other than that. Like, this was their experience. Now, the funny thing is, on November 22nd, 1963, Aubrey in the book says himself, he says, I wasn't particularly politically inclined, and he says, I wasn't even aware that President Kennedy was going to be in the city that day. And it was my attendant, Dennis, or Peanuts, that told me. He said, well, Kennedy's in town. They're going to be at the Trademark for lunch, and there'll be a motorcade and so on. So, getting back to the story, Aubrey said to Peanuts when they were leaving Baylor, he said, there's no way we're going to get back to the funeral home in time to see the president. So Aubrey headed over to Pearl Street and went north on Pearl, and he found a location at the southeast corner of the intersection of Cedar Springs and Harwood. And they got in behind the crowd there, and they parked the ambulance, got out of the car, and they climbed up on the roof of the ambulance and sat on the roof. And it was probably about 12:17, and the president's car was turning left onto Harwood right in front of them. On top of this car, somehow they caught the attention of the president, and he turned in his seat and waved right at them. And Aubrey said our hearts were racing. He says it was unbelievable. He says they looked better than you'd ever imagine in any photographs or anything. And he says, and they were waving right directly at Peanuts and I. He says, we were so pumped. Then he said, as the motorcade passed, or as the president's car passed, he says, we jumped down from our car, and as we jumped down, we realized we were being called on our ambulance radio by our dispatcher, and it was on an epileptic seizure call in the 100 block of North Houston Street, directly across the road from the Sallyport entrance. And the Sallyport entrance actually shows up in a lot of photos of DEALEY PLAZA. It was the entrance to the Dallas County Jail on the east side of Houston. And it's tucked in between what was the County Criminal Records building and the County Criminal Courthouse. And it's also the building where Oswald was to have been transferred from the Dallas City Jail. Aubrey said we couldn't get on Harwood at this point. We'd have to try and pass the motorcade. So he says we went south on Pearl to Main and turned right on Main, and we went west on Main, and the police had to let us through the crowd at the corner of Harwood and Main, which they were holding back for the motorcade. We got down Main Street, and we pulled up, and this epileptic seizure person was kind of sitting on the sidewalk on the west side of Houston Street, across from the Sallyport, and he said he didn't appear to us to have had an epileptic seizure. He wasn't scuffed, the clothing wasn't torn or anything else. He had a bit of what they call a raspberry on his forehead. They tried to talk to him, and he was a little bit incoherent, and Aubrey thought, well, we can't leave him here. This is a critical arterial in the president's motorcade. In fact, while they were talking to him, or when they arrived at that location, it was actually about 12:20 or 12:21, which ironically is apparently when the president was due to pass at that spot, which raises some other questions.
Apparently he was late because the crowds were so thick. He had trouble getting
plus
through
he stayed at the airport for a while, longer than they expected. Some people have speculated that the action and excitement with the ambulance on Houston drew a lot of people up onto Houston off of Elm Street where the shooting would occur, which thinned out the crowd. And other people have speculated that with that kind of attention, it would certainly draw people's vision away from any of the surrounding buildings or the stockade fence or any other locations where people may have then been moving into position. That raises some questions. Those aren't Aubrey's, those are just questions that other people have discussed for all the years since.
Well, certainly in the movie JFK, Oliver Stone portrays it that way. He says that this is definitely a diversion for people to get into their position, as you just said.
And that may well be what it is. I mean, we don't know that now, but it's definitely a point of speculation that bears revisiting. Aubrey and Dennis put their man on the stretcher. They placed him in the ambulance, and they went code 3 up to Houston. They turned left on Elm.
November 22nd, 1963. He's telling the story of Aubrey Rike, and he's got a book out called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Rike and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Tonight we're getting a completely different perspective. I had a whole series on the JFK assassination back in November, but now I feel like I have been right in DEALEY PLAZA. I have been right in Trauma Room 1. It's a very, very interesting perspective. Speaking about getting his book, you can get it at a terrific website. If you're interested at all in any of this conspiracy about the President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, terrific resource right online, www.jfklancer.com. And of course, Lancer was President Kennedy's code name given to him by the Secret Service. Colin, I want to ask you a question as a fellow Canadian. Why are we so enthralled with the President Kennedy assassination?
Well, I think the people before that time were as interested in Franklin Roosevelt, and I think people before him were as interested in people like William McKinley and Garfield and Lincoln. And I think it's because the power of the presidency was then and still is probably the most powerful elected official position in the world. It encompasses far more than the prime ministership of Great Britain or the prime ministership of Canada or Australia or any other country. And the decisions that are made in the Oval Office and the actions and the opinion and the views of the person occupying that position have tremendous global significance. President Kennedy, like any American president, was the physical embodiment to us, the representation of all of our hopes and fears and all of our best dreams and wishes. When he was killed, when he was struck down, for me personally, it was like a thunderbolt, and it was like a kick in the gut. I don't know how to describe it. I felt as sick or more so than I ever had with the loss of any of my own relatives. We really felt like we'd lost a member of our family. I mean, I can't explain to you why. I just know that's how we felt.
That's your feeling. Yeah. Same way here. I'm going to ask you to speculate now. I'm going to ask you to walk us through what you feel happened in the terms of the conspiracy to JFK. And whatever you want to say is fine. You don't have to justify it. If it's just a feeling, that's fine.
I personally feel that if you're looking for something you can look at and listen to that would probably steer you in the right direction, I would say that if you were to sit down and look at that section of Oliver Stone's movie JFK and watch the conversation that, never actually took place in real life, but the conversation that takes place between Mr. X, played by Donald Sutherland, and Jim Garrison, played by Kevin Costner, where they have their little meeting outdoors in Washington, D.C. That, to me, gives you so much information. It explains it largely from the perspective of Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who Donald Sutherland was in part portraying. That's who furnished a lot of that information that was woven into the script, was Colonel Fletcher Prouty. I really prefer dealing with stuff that we know for an absolute fact.
A series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Castro thought the Americans were about to attack, and he wanted Khrushchev to order those missiles fired and eliminate this scourge from the face of the earth. We'd all been lied to about it. Khrushchev had a back-channel means of corresponding with Kennedy. He lied about what he was doing in Cuba. War was likely to come, and some of those hawks were saying, "I told you so." That all of us sitting around that table could be sitting there in our last day on Earth.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war.
Back to Aubrey Rike.
So, his feeling, and this is expressed in the book, is that his feeling about the timing of the call, which the FBI said the dispatch call went out at 12:19 p.m., that dispatched call, he thought, wouldn't that have been something if we had been racing down Main Street or any of the alternate routes with our ambulance siren blaring and ricocheting off the buildings? He says they never would have heard those shots.
That's right.
So that's his observation. Then, of course, he picks up the epileptic, and off they went to the hospital. And again, as I said, Dennis and Aubrey were probably in the process of unloading their man from the rear of the ambulance when the shooting occurred, which is why they didn't hear about it and wound up standing at the emergency desk watching the victims of the shooting being brought in.
I want to ask you, Aubrey picked the body up. And he
the president's body?
That's right. And physically picked it up to put it in the coffin.
Right.
And he felt his head. What did he feel, or not feel, I should say, at his head?
Well, they'll back up a bit. The Secret Service approached them in the corridor and asked, he says, do you gentlemen work for a mortuary? He said, yes, sir, we do. And he said, can you call your mortuary and have them bring a casket? Tell them it's for the president. So Aubrey hopped down off the cot. He went to the major medicine nursing desk, which was right across from stall 8 where they'd placed their ambulance patient. And while he was using the phone, he noticed that stall number 8 was empty and that the gentleman was gone. And so we deal with Aubrey's reflections on that. I don't know just what amount of time had elapsed, whether it had been 20 or 25 or 30 minutes. Aubrey's not entirely sure himself. He said probably 20, somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes. And he said he may have been moved to another area for treatment, like they were moving other patients out of that area, because a lot of the local and state dignitaries and federal dignitaries and agents and whatnot were basically filling up most of the area that they refer to as major medicine. So he says the patients, for the most part, were being moved elsewhere. He used the phone, called the funeral home. He got his boss on the phone. His name was Mr. Vernon B. O'Neill, known as Peg O'Neill. When he told Mr. O'Neill they were looking for a casket, Mr. O'Neill said, well, we've already been contacted. We'll be there shortly. He says, we're just loading one up. When Mr. O'Neill arrived, he had his brand new 1964 Cadillac hearse. It was an aspen white. Aubrey was summoned that Mr. O'Neill had arrived, so Aubrey went out to the emergency dock. The president's car was already gone, and the ambulance was backed in where the president's car had been, and they got the church truck out, which is a folding four-wheeled cart for moving a casket around, and they set that up behind their hearse, opened the rear door, and he and Mr. O'Neill pulled this about a 425-pound solid bronze ceremonial casket called an Elgin Britannia, and they pulled the casket out, put it on the church truck, and rolled it inside to the trauma area. He and Peanuts were summoned at that point to go into the trauma room, and they went into the trauma room. The president was lying on the table. There was a full sheet covering the body. They pulled the sheet back, as they had been told by the Secret Service to check the president for sanitation and make sure he was ready to move for transport back to Washington, D.C. So they pulled the sheet down off the torso, and they were examining him and had him turned on his side and looked at his back to see if there was any blood or anything. Now, as far as we know, Aubrey and Dennis and possibly Doris Nelson, the nurse that was the head of the emergency nursing staff at the time, they were probably the only three, as far as we know, that observed the president's back in terms of the back of his torso. Of course, as we know from the autopsy, there was a bullet hole in the back. A lot of people have speculated, what did Aubrey really see? Well, Aubrey doesn't remember seeing a bullet hole, but you have to remember a penetrating wound usually doesn't bleed very much, if at all, especially something that's maybe 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 millimeters in diameter. You're talking about something that's around the size of the end of your pen. He said he noticed several little flecks and spots of dried blood, and he says any one of them might have been what they later identified as a bullet wound at the autopsy. But he said we weren't sent in there to examine the body. We weren't there as trained forensic staff, so he says we weren't doing an examination for wounds. We just had to make sure that we were going to be able to transport him without there being a mess. He said at that point we put him on his back. He said we went to lift him to casket him, and somebody said, hey, he hasn't had his last rites yet. We need to get a priest. So then a priest was summoned, and they waited for that. Aubrey said it felt like it took about a half hour for the priest to get there, and he and Peanuts were in the room with Mrs. Kennedy and Miss Nelson and Secret Service agents and witnessed the last rites being administered. At some point, Mrs. Kennedy removed her wedding ring, and she wanted to place it on her husband's finger. And this is the part Aubrey really gets quite emotional, still upsets him, and he'll cry quite openly when he starts talking about it. She was trying to get her ring on her husband's finger, and Aubrey dutifully went to the equipment cart, and he grabbed a tube of surgeon's lubricating jelly, and he got some on his fingers, and he rubbed the president's pinky with it. so that she could hopefully get her wedding ring on her husband's hand, and she did manage to get it up to about the first or second knuckle. He says, that's good there. And so she kissed the president's hand, and I believe she also kissed the toe. Then they basically covered the torso. She had pulled the sheet off of the president as well, down to his waist, and had examined his torso. Aubrey was saying that he noticed there was a cut in the throat before the First Lady had entered the room, and he said, boy, that's quite a nasty-looking little cut. And Doris Nelson, the head nurse of the emergency department, said, well, that is a tracheostomy, but she says it was also a bullet wound. And she didn't describe whether it was an entry or an exit or anything else. We know from what the doctors said, and I can read you some of their verbatim statements about the wound before the tracheostomy was done if you're interested.
Sure, please.
Basically, she just mentioned Doris Nelson said that was a bullet wound and they used it to facilitate a tracheostomy. And he said, well, that's a very nasty-looking trach. Now, I would mention the book also contains Aubrey's hand-drawn illustrations that he did 4.5 years ago for me in his home. The only time he's ever undertaken to draw what he saw of the throat wound and what he saw or felt of the head wound. And so these are in the book for the first time published anywhere.
That's terrific.
Basically, that's as much as he can say about the throat wound. Again, as I say, he didn't see a back wound. Now, the head, he said, was wrapped in a separate sheet. He did not pull that sheet off. He did not see the face. He did not see the ears or the jaw or the mouth or anything. He saw a little bit of the forehead when the priest pulled the sheet down to anoint the forehead with some holy oil. And other than that, he didn't observe visually any condition of the head. Now, when he and Dennis went to casket the president, Aubrey, being the man in charge of the car, he normally would take the head end of the patient or the victim, and he reached underneath the back of the shoulders and up underneath the neck and the head with his right hand, and he said, as he slipped his hand underneath the sheet, he could feel where the skull had been blasted out. Okay, those are his words. The back of the skull had been blasted out. And he said, I could feel the shards of bone through the sheet on my hand. He says there was no pain caused by it, but you could feel the shards. And he said, through the sheet, I could also feel what there was of the brain, and it was warm and it was moving on my hand.
Oh, gee whiz.
Which is more than what a lot of the doctors experienced, right?
Yes, yeah.
So then he slid his hand the rest of the way under to be able to better take control of the body, and as he did, his hand and sleeve came up from the other side of the president's head. It was smeared with blood. So he said to Miss Nelson, he said, we're going to need something we can use as a dam or some kind of a rubber sheet, because otherwise it's going to soil the casket interior. And I believe it was Dr. Philip Earl Williams, again, that went and managed to obtain what you would call a rubber or plasticized mattress cover, and it would be something like a fitted sheet. And they took that from the attendant that brought it into them, and Aubrey took that, and they lined the casket, and he rolled it up to make kind of a dam to catch anything that would run out of the president's head on the journey to Washington. And they managed to pick the president up. They had enshrouded him in a fresh sheet around his torso and everything, and they placed him in the casket. The president blessed the interior of the casket with holy water. They closed the casket. They sealed it. It was actually a sealing, airtight, protective casket. The priest then reached and placed a crucifix on the casket lid, which was magnetized. He continued to bless the casket, and Aubrey was saying that the security of that room, as painful as it was to be there, it was great because there was so much hollering and fighting and shouting going on out in major medicine that he says we felt this was kind of like an inner sanctum, and we were in kind of a world of peace where immediately outside the door, there was like a huge verbal war going on. Now, the war was apparently over the issue of whether an autopsy was required in Dallas County or not, and of course it was required. Aubrey doesn't call it this, but I do, and several other historians do, it was nothing short of a hijacking, an illegal passing of jurisprudence, if you will, and they took the body out of the hospital. There was quite a pushing and shoving match that went on in the corridor in major medicine, and Aubrey said the casket at several points almost got pushed off the church truck, and he'd have to reach underneath and re-steady the casket and reset the church truck, otherwise it would have gone to the floor. Mrs. Kennedy was hanging on to the casket the whole time. There were several Secret Service agents. There were some other local authorities trying to push the casket back in. Aubrey said we'd push one way for a while, they'd push it back the other way, and finally some guy in the back, he doesn't know who it was, he says, let the so-and-so go. He says, Saren Ward's going to sign a death certificate. So he doesn't know whether that was the coroner, who was Earl Rose, or just who it was, but Saren Ward was a justice of the peace, and of course, for the Dallas County anyway, he's gone down in history as a man that signed the Texas Medical Certificate of Death, which is riddled with some really interesting contradictions and some problems, and ultimately wasn't even the death certificate that President Kennedy was officially buried under.
Thanks so much, folks, for listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. See you next time.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.